The original Hotline Miami was so pure in its intentions and executions. So many executions. My god, was this game a florid catastrophe of brutal violence and hypnotic 80s inspired synthwave. The whole package is an unmitigated kaleidoscope of techno beats and overstimulating bursts of color, whether it's from the geysers of blood or the flashes of light that accompany every crunchy thwack. It's a satisfying combination of senses that encourages you to chase down your targets in a frenzy. Or if it doesn't in the beginning, you'll soon learn to love your burgeoning relationship with that vicious part of your brain. Because without it, Jacket here will die very quickly. It only takes one bullet or one smack with a weapon to bring him down. But the same goes for all of his enemies. You're not really supposed to ask questions or hesitate because you won't survive for long otherwise. This relentless pursuit of violence is echoed in the narrative, as Jacket near absent-mindedly follows the commands of a mysterious caller, providing him the locations of people to kill. As he tears through the Russian mobsters at each address, the player starts to clue into the subtle derealization inherent in the mechanics. The enemies stop being people when killing them is this tough. They're more like stations in an obstacle course, challenges to complete as fast as possible, moving to the next puzzle without thinking, as bright lights and loud sounds go off when you solve it. That's why completing a level is so sobering. After spending all that time in a high arousal state, concentrating as hard as you can on surviving, adrenaline going as you comb through the level for the last surviving goon, the music cuts out. The level gets quiet, and all the bodies just lie there, vacant as the building you're escaping. The drastic change of tone makes players a bit too hyper-aware of how their skillful level completion amounted to a gruesome rampage. Once the shock sets in and the rush fades, you just gotta get out of there as fast as you can. The uncertainty and drastic tonal oscillation escalate into a full-on dissociative nightmare, as a series of increasingly horrific images and experiences challenge what's real and what's the result of a mind slowly drowning in its own bloodlust. Much of the imagery along his journey feels like flashes of a decaying consciousness. Even if he were lucid, which, doubtful, the ambiguity of Jacket's story reflects his ignorance as a protagonist. Through all his trials, all his sacrifices, and all his skills, Jacket isn't really in control of his life. The bloody brick road leads him to the Russian mob boss, and while the final battle is exciting to behold, it's honestly quite bleak. He never gets any answers, never understands who made these phone calls, or what the purpose of his rampage was all about. And at this stage, he doesn't care. The kind of character who can find fulfillment in being made to kill by a distant voice probably didn't have much going for him to begin with. Alone, purposeless, and incapable of understanding the bigger picture. He's just going through the motions. The big boss was killed at the end, so everything I went through had to mean something, right? That's closure? Jacket's whole experience doesn't really resolve, it just dissolves. He's killed the last dude and stopped trying to question what his life or his actions amounted to. So someone else needed to ask the hard questions and figure out why people like him were being called to violence. Except Biker's not really the inquisitive type either. He's another violent ding-dong who got bored of being jerked around by a telephone and tried to figure out who was calling him this whole time. If only out of spite, he finds the hideout of 50 Blessings, a domestic terrorist group recruiting men like him and Jacket to kill Russian mobsters. Directionless and wayward men who aren't really good for much else except killing and taking orders to kill again. If their target isn't hopeless or antisocial enough to just do what they say, then they start making threats, forcing violence out of their victims through coercion. But despite being discovered by Biker, killing these two dweebs won't roll back the clock on their ultimate plan or explain how they were able to get away with it for this long. That's where Hotline Miami 2 Wrong Number comes in, offering answers to questions we didn't even know we had. In all, providing a full picture of the nation that spawned 50 Blessings and the mass killings is really complicated. So much so that the attempt struggles to take shape in a linear or organized fashion. The time jumps, ensemble cast, unexpected continuity, wild difficulty spikes, and larger scope were all a major deviation from the simple purity of the original game, and I can understand why some fans and critics were put off by the sequel's ambitions. When some of the cast is only ever theoretically adjacent to the central narrative, I empathize with those who threw up their hands and submitted to the confusion. By playing the game at all, they, like many of the characters in the game, acted without fully understanding what they were accomplishing, taking their eyes off the master plan by indulging in the violence. The fans have absolutely no idea what they're supposed to be doing, to the point of actual comedy. All they know is that Jacket was cool, and they wanted to be just like him. Without actually getting calls from the 50 Blessings operatives, these clowns just roam around brutalizing people of no consequence, right up until they mess with the absolute last person in Miami they should have ever crossed. They're mostly just a bunch of bored idiots who idolized a local rampage killer, thinking their hollow nobility would distinguish them from the class of dirtbags they belong to. Their narrative pointlessness is reinforced by their deeply stupid mechanics, each of which are about 50% awesome and 50% worthless. At no point, ever, in my entire time playing this game, was Mark the Bear's two-sided machine gun spread attack useful at all. Never. It's actually easier to just point where I want the bullets to go, rather than pull some action movie stunt that gets me killed. The same thing with Cory the Zebra's dodge roll. It's a great way to roll into gunfire or accidentally corner myself in a room full of enemies. Tony the Tiger has great punches, but without a gun, he can only draw attention with his body, putting himself in unnecessary danger just to get his enemies in range. Finally, Alex's chainsaw rules, and it's hilarious that a gas-powered motor blade doesn't alert the guards like the guns do. But it's fine, because Ash's guns are much better for drawing enemies to your position than for killing anyone. Because no, I don't rely on the aim of a man standing 3 feet away from me at any given moment. Jake, on the other hand, knows exactly what he wants to do, which is kill foreigners. He's a racist, nationalist, bloodthirsty, valor-stealing cretin who loves to kill for his country and hates that anyone would expect him to ask questions about it. This guy is an absolute find to accelerationist groups like 50 Blessings. He's a deeply disturbed and profoundly dangerous bootlicker, proud that he's too stupid to understand what forces are at work behind the scenes. And in the end, this dipshit died exactly how he lived. Clueless and alone, yet somehow completely self-righteous about it. Oh, and he has his fair share of idiot gimmicks too, like his nail gun that can barely aim straight, or his comical nunchaku charge. Again, just a great way to get killed by pretending you're a badass in a crappy action movie. And speaking of crappy action movies, the widest peddlers of ignorance have to be actor Martin Brown and the director of his slasher flick, Midnight Animal. Two absolute vultures looking to cash in on the hype around Jacket's killing spree. Much like the rest of Miami, they can't fully understand why or how someone would go on a rampage like that. They fundamentally do not understand who Jacket was, what his life was like leading up to his crimes, and how someone like him could be exploited by a radical political group. They're not interested in depicting a human being someone might relate to, because doing so means admitting they're also vulnerable to extremism, violence, and uncritical obedience. Turning Jacket into a cartoon serial killer is a defensive artistic position against accidentally revealing any uncomfortable truths about their audience. It's why the two of them fall back on the most salacious, over-the-top depictions of kooky clown show craziness, and other psycho killer tropes that populate the minds of hack writers. The pig mask wearing creep was a violent monster looking to indulge in sadistic urges. The phone calls weren't coded messages from political extremists. The killer was just hearing voices that made him want to murder for fun. Jacket didn't take that woman away from the mobsters for a noble reason. They weren't two traumatized souls looking for temporary safety in each other while their lives unraveled. This genuine human connection didn't make Jacket a liability to 50 Blessings, leading them to orchestrate the woman's death. No, he was just a pervert who wanted a sex slave. Martin and the director never tried to understand Jacket, so they filled in the blanks with tasteless slasher movie cliches, including the sexual assault. This, to answer critics like Jacob Geller, is the point of that scene. Shock value is often the domain of people without the talent or insight to speak with nuance. In lieu of evoking any other emotions, they settle for disgust as a cheap imitation of profundity, because it's easier for these two men to be cruel than it is for them to be honest. Hotline Miami 2's best trick was putting all of these morons into context. Far from speculating about their personality or brain pathology, the game instead presents a thin slice of the political norms that conditioned and encouraged violence in each of them. Think about the implications of setting these games in the 1980s in the United States. To briefly summarize a whole decade of history, there's a resurgence of Cold War nuclear anxiety, with a new president determined to make the US a military superpower after the last one earned a reputation as an ineffectual peacenik. And since I feel bad for calling him out earlier, I suggest you watch Jacob Geller's video, The Conceptual Failure of Orbital Lasers, for an informative look at why President Ronald Reagan's embarrassingly conceived Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars program, was also a diplomatic nightmare that threatened to accelerate nuclear war with the USSR. In line with foreign policy, domestic policy shifted toward a tough-on-crime attitude, which usually took the form of longer prison sentences. President Ronald Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which provided money for prisons, drug education, and treatment, but most infamously created mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. This punitive provision disproportionately targeted crack cocaine users, many of whom were black and working class. Any outspoken pushback against these laws for being ineffective, racist, or classist was met with accusations of being soft on crime. The notorious 1988 Weekend Pass attack ad against Democratic presidential candidate Mike Dukakis stated that his opposition to the death penalty and support for prison inmate furloughs allowed convicted murderer Willie Horton to commit a robbery and rape while on temporary prison leave. His subsequent loss to Republican George H.W. Bush most likely scared Democrats away from supporting laws that showed clemency to people in the justice system. Democratic President Bill Clinton passed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, a law that included harsher sentences, increased funding for prisons, and 3 strikes laws. These strict criminal policies and expansions to prisons were encouraged by a population deeply afraid of crime. A New York Times article by Jania Belafonte cited criminologist Dennis Kenny's work. While asking New Yorkers how safe they felt in the city in the mid-80s, many reported fear for their inevitable victimization, while 3% of the people he interviewed reported carrying a gun. According to a New York Times poll in 1985, half the New Yorkers questioned believed that crime was the worst thing about living in the city, and a similar portion of those polled felt compelled to take justice into their own hands. Dr. Kenny also noted that New Yorkers actually had a 0.001% chance of being attacked on a single subway ride. Yet this belief in their inevitable victimization lingered in spite of the data. Based on this research, it's no wonder so many people of the time expressed support for subway vigilante Bernard Goetz. Bernie Goetz became infamous for his shooting of 4 black teenagers in 1984 after they allegedly tried to rob him on the subway. Many people who heard about the shooting applauded him, championing the image of a man cleaning up the streets and taking a stand against crime when the government wouldn't. An alternate account of the incident might see Goetz as an agitated racist who brought a gun on the subway and was looking to start a fight with any black person who looked at him wrong. However, it's pretty hard to overstate just how much of the public loved this man for what he did, and conversations about the racist motivations behind his actions were sadly overshadowed by the legacy of vigilante worship. Hotline Miami 2 doesn't directly address the racist component to narratives of vigilante violence, as it doesn't center black perspectives in its criticism, but it does show how violence, harsh justice, and self-interested vigilantism were wedded to the national consciousness. Steeped in this historical context, Hotline Miami 2 depicts a psychological trickle-down violence. From the violence inherent in supporting the US's global military campaign against communism, to the insistence that social problems can and should be solved with the same type of violence at home. Let's start from the top and focus on the US military conquest against Russia. Even though Hotline Miami depicts an alternate history, the conflict in Hawaii can easily represent the fighting against communists in Korea or Vietnam. Hell, we even have military bases in Hawaii to extend US operations into the Pacific Theater. It's here where we find jacket, beard, Daniels, and the Lieutenant General, fighting against the Russians in Hawaii, tearing apart the island in America's bid for global capitalist victory. These characters make up a small squad of elite fighters in a nearly hopeless resistance against Russian encroachment. This special unit of trained killers is sent exclusively on suicide missions, utterly outnumbered and outgunned on the losing end of a war. As Beard, our missions were to infiltrate and rush the enemy encampments, hitting them with the same strategic ferocity that Jacket used during his encounters with Russian mobsters. These missions provide narrative context for the dominant gameplay strategy. The ruthless, combo-building rampage style that Hotline Miami trained in its players was something the protagonists learned at war. The only way they could survive these doomed missions was to embrace the hopelessness, race headlong into the slaughter without thinking. Don't pause to second-guess yourself, or you're dead. The missions in Hawaii also explained why 50 Blessings targeted ex-military guys like Jacket. They were groomed to be ruthless from the start, to break through their resistance to killing and see human life in the most reductive ways possible, including their own. They think of themselves as tools operating in service of their country's agenda, inherently expendable to the goal of American hegemony. This wouldn't change when they return to civilian life. Killing really well is pretty antisocial in most contexts, and without the structure of a military that can use those skills, guys like Jacket are turned over to a society under this universe's equivalent of Reaganism. There are no mental health services, no social safety nets, and no support systems. Just a job well done and a door hitting their ass on the way out to the Darwinian hellscape of individualist capitalism. Assuming they can't hold down several jobs like Beard can, it's no wonder that many of them ended up with a group like 50 Blessings. Suddenly their skills were useful again, and they got a second chance to win at home the war they lost abroad. This group offered a source of purpose, again, asking outright for what their military training only implied. Sacrifice your life and the lives of others to see American values conquer the world. Meanwhile in America, the persistent threat of inevitable victimization lingers in the minds of Hotline Miami's characters. They fear the encroachment of Russians, Colombians, and other foreigners in their communities. Slowly, we start to see violent, domineering, and militaristic attitudes enter the cultural imagination. Jacket, for everything that was wrong with him, had considerable support from the people who thought the police hadn't done enough to stop crime in Miami. It's also by his example that police get more aggressive, and civilians feel encouraged to take justice into their own hands. Besides, according to schlocky garbage like Midnight Animal, criminals are sadistic killers not bound by recognizable humanity. They can't be reasoned with or understood as the product of economic scarcity and social prejudice. They can only be killed. Here we see the mindset behind the Weekend Pass attack ad come back. If the government is unwilling to stop monsters from walking free, then you have to be the one to make sure they're punished. The language of military conquest gets repurposed for domestic terror. The fans, Jake, and even many of the 50 Blessing killers fit into the Bernie Goetz-shaped mold that American society had fallen in love with. Only Hotline Miami 2 is smart enough to show how terrible these people actually are. Groomed on narratives of US military conquest abroad, Jake was almost frothing at the mouth for a chance to kill Russians. The fans found a convenient target for their self-aggrandizement in the Colombians, immigrants who were easy to turn into an identifiable other. Then there's Pardo, the Miami Mutilator. He's a terrifying character because he's what happens when someone with institutional power wants to be a vigilante. He's Hotline Miami's equivalent of the cops who wear Punisher paraphernalia. The people who are supposed to protect us openly idolizing a serial killer with untreated PTSD. Pardo relishes his monopoly on violence and feels empowered by a culture that sees criminals as enemy combatants. All these protagonists, all these killers, saw the example set by Jacket, a man trained to dutifully kill his enemies because someone told him it was right. In total, Hotline Miami establishes its trickle-down model of violence to explain how its world has normalized death, one that parallels a similar trend in real-world history. The war and the military expansion needed to enforce capitalism as the dominant ideology required servicemen who could dehumanize their enemies and treat their own life with contempt. That violent eye turned inward to domestic policies and pop culture, which reproduced militaristic attitudes of domination and punishment at home as well as abroad. Police need to be violent so they can win the war against crime, and politicians need to make criminals suffer with their legislation. Art and news media then feed the public's appetite for animalistic criminals and good citizens who put them down. The unstable man with a weapon and homicidal intent who appears to take a stand against crime is admired by others, grooming the population to love the violence. 50 Blessings is just more honest about how much they love the killing and who they love to target. 50 Blessings optimize the process of finding unstable men and picking their targets, in this case, Russians. With enough violence against Russian mob groups, they felt that the American people would rise up and take their country back from the foreign criminals. Like all accelerationist groups, 50 Blessings doesn't have to change the political machinery of the United States to serve their own ends. They only need to grease the wheels of conflict with some strategically applied blood. There were plenty of Americans who could get behind their goal of war, when all they needed was the nudge in a violent direction. The protagonists thought their willingness to kill made them special, that they weren't just fitting into the plans of a reactionary political agenda, one whose success would ironically cost them their lives and doom the country they love so much. The only two characters capable of seeing the bigger picture were Evan the writer and Richter the rat. Evan wasn't satisfied with the simple explanation for Jacket's crimes. He felt there was something deeper to the whole event, so he spends most of the game tracking down other people who heard from 50 Blessings. When he couldn't get any answers from Pardo, a police detective who should have been investigating Jacket rather than following his example, he went to the source. He cut through the noise and sensationalism to get at the heart of the conspiracy, a dedication that unfortunately cost him his marriage. Interestingly enough, Evan's levels are completed without killing people. This makes him unique when juxtaposed with his gameplay counterparts. He's not looking to externalize his emotional baggage or replicate the cultural ideal of violent domination, he just wants answers. Evan's journey for those answers led him to Richter, an unlikely player in the whole scheme. We last saw him killing Jacket's girlfriend, and possibly getting wrecked himself, but as his own story plays out in the sequel, we realize just how much pressure he was under from 50 Blessings. They destroyed his car for refusing to cooperate, and it's heavily implied that they threatened his sickly mother, who struggled to take care of herself as her unnamed condition progressed. It's sad to watch an otherwise good man get pressed into increasingly dangerous missions. He wants to be the good person his mother thinks he is, and it clearly breaks his heart to live this double life behind her back. But he doesn't really have any other options. Yet with the profound difficulty spike in Richter's chapters, it's hard to shake the feeling that he's being set up, that his desire to escape and to do right by his mother has made him a liability. It's quite possible that he's not supposed to survive these missions. This feeling of sabotage comes to a head when 50 Blessings attempts to kill Richter in a prison riot. In one of the most tense and gruesome levels in the game, Richter must carve his way through the melee, killing guard and prisoner alike. Through sheer determination, breakneck survival skills, and the disorderly chaos in the fallout, he manages to escape. By helping Evan with his book, he's able to get himself and his mother to Hawaii, seemingly flee the clutches of 50 Blessings. Richter feels like the heart of the story. The character players should feel most affection for. He's clearly wrapped up in circumstances he can't control, and his efforts to fight back against 50 Blessings have only put the person he loves in greater danger. Richter feels a lot of remorse for the lives he's taken, and the role he's played in all this death. But his capacity to care for people other than himself is part of why he gets such a happy ending. For a while, at least. If there's anything Hotline Miami wants to express as an artistic statement, it's that the people most invested in violence are blind to the bigger picture. They will never comprehend the forces, political or cultural, that drive them to act. Jacket spent the whole game doing what he thought would give his life purpose, only to end up killing the one man who was even capable of finding real answers. The other characters were pulled in myriad different directions, all leading them away from the truth of their actions. The final chapter of Hotline Miami 2 feels like the culmination of that message. For all the characters driven to violence by 50 Blessings, the son, the new boss of the Russian mob, is probably least aware of his role in the conspiracy. To gain back the ground his father lost to Jacket, the son goes to war against the Colombians. His levels are brutal, hectic, so goddamn annoying, and only survivable by fully embracing the frenzy of the Hotline Miami gameplay loop. You need to hit them fast and hard, otherwise you're done for. Yet for all his victories over the rival gang, the son's actions don't amount to anything. He's still carrying the pain of losing his family to Jacket, and with violent retribution as his only tool, he inevitably gives 50 Blessings what they want. After binging on some dangerously hard drugs, the son goes on a rampage, tearing through most of his own gang before fighting these vibrant images of wild animals. It quickly becomes clear that in his trip, the son is killing each of the fans during their mid-game assault on the Russian mob's tower. This wild, non-linear story has converged in a moment of glorious and oh-so-pointless death. None of these characters took back their old lives or made anything good of their new ones. Going to battle didn't give them the victory or satisfaction they were looking for. They just flailed around for a while before snuffing each other out, allowing 50 Blessings to fulfill their ultimate goal. When the US and Russian presidents met to address the conflict between their nations, one of the 50 Blessings agents entrenched in the military ranks successfully assassinated the both of them. The conflict started by 50 Blessings created the opportunity for their accelerationist mission to climax. In a moment, far away from any of the protagonists' petty squabbles, both world leaders were killed, leaving these wounded nations with only one option left. One inevitable conclusion. I understand why a game like Hotline Miami 2 would get so many puzzled and disappointed reactions from the people who liked the original game. It's fun to get really good at killing, getting higher and higher scores as you perfect each scenario and become an overall better player. Hotline Miami really only revealed how pointless Jacket's experience was if you thought about it for too long, which is exactly what the game trains you not to do. Hotline Miami 2 makes the pointlessness viciously apparent. No matter how good you got at the game, no matter how effectively you completed the levels, rampage killing was never going to stop 50 Blessings. You can't build a better future by clinging to an ideology of death, and you can't save the world with the tactics of those who would see it destroyed. I don't think Hotline Miami 2 has a reductionist or condescending anti-violence message. I think this bloody duology just wants players to interrogate where our narratives on aggression come from, and whose agenda is served when we assign others as enemies worthy of violence, whose attitudes have trickled down into our sense of right and wrong. Hotline Miami 2 paints a picture of a nation whose drive for global domination led to a culture of violence at home, a way of thinking that left its population without the means to avert its own destruction. That's the part that hurts the most. All the characters were so wrapped up in their malformed ideas of righteous violence that just acknowledging 50 Blessings wasn't even an option, let alone stopping them. For as much as I don't care about ludonarrative dissonance and really struggle to take that shallow accusation seriously, I gotta applaud Hotline Miami 2 Wrong Number for using both ludonarrative harmony and ludonarrative dissonance in the same game on purpose. Each of the protagonists are perfectly embodied by their mechanics, either through their affinity for violence, their external pressure to kill, or their embarrassing inability to think about the consequences of their actions. As players get better at each level, they become more acutely attuned to the motivations and goals of their specific character. Dominate your enemies, survive long enough, or find out the truth. That's where the ludonarrative harmony comes from. But then at the end, the story reveals that none of their actions mattered. Getting good at this game only accelerated your path to the end, when 50 Blessings burned the world away. This ludonarrative dissonance is so cruel, so unsatisfying, and I love it. The bleak finale of Hotline Miami 2 allows a sprawling story of deeply unhappy people to just end, unambiguously realizing the devastating outcome for a socio-political system built on violent conquest. One that cannot imagine a world that hasn't been carved into the skulls of its enemies. Even in an alternate 1980s timeline, the US is defined by its Cold War politics, draconian domestic policies, and consequent affection for vigilante violence. 50 Blessings are incredible villains because they see the US's most violent tendencies as its best qualities, and thus can only show their love with even more bloodshed. This is the trickle-down violence that defines Hotline Miami 2, and drives its characters to their own violent ends, where they could not be saved from themselves.